We are here to break down episode 5 of Widow's Bay, and boy, this episode takes us on one hell of a trip. This 5th episode was great because we get some more insight of the founder of the island, we learn more about the boogeyman and what actually happened to Tom's wife, so we're going to break down this entire episode. With that being said, full spoilers ahead. First off, man, I love this damn show so much, and we'll talk about my overall thoughts at the end of this breakdown, but let's talk about the opening scene here, which takes us to this winter setting where we find this mysterious guy coming out of the woods. He seems to be lost until he stumbles on these mysterious mushrooms and he eats them all up. Now, it was kind of hard to make out who this was, but as we'll talk about later, this was 100% Hamish Linklater's character, who goes by Richard Warren, who is the founder of Widow's Bay. I will talk about Richard a little bit later in this breakdown, but now in our present timeline, after his encounter with the Sea Hag and Patricia's killer party, we see Tom implements his curfew on the town, and they are pissed. Now, I knew that this trio would be fun, but the big three of Tom, Wick, and Patricia was just elite in this episode. Our big three goes to Bryce's office, and they look through all his things, and Wick finds something that's important, and we'll discuss a little bit later. But in the meantime, after seeing this word scratched out on his desk saying that his eye is now open, we see Tom finds the same looking mushroom that we opened the episode with, but he also calls his number that Bryce called a bunch of times, and they set up this meeting with the mysterious person on the other line. Now at this mysterious person's house, who by the way goes by the name of Todd, and I thought he was hilarious in this episode, but he ended up going to school with Patricia, so they knew each other, and he's the local drug dealer, or let me correct myself, he is the local shaman. Anyway, we see Tom shows Todd the mushrooms. We get some backstory on them. We find out they grow locally on the island, and they're referred to as true sight, which is actually a term that's used in D&D and basically allows people to see things that others can't see, or as Todd says, they take you on a trip regardless if you want to go or not, as it also opens up your third eye. Now, after learning what happened to Bryce, we see Todd sharing the story about one of his friends who also took the mushroom, and it completely changed this person after seeing something that he couldn't talk about, and I believe that we see this same thing later in the episode. Now, Wick agrees to take the true sight, but unfortunately Todd mistakenly thought that Tom was Wick, and he gave it to him accidentally. Of course, Tom freaks out after learning that this will be a 12-hour trip, and he can't throw it up, and Todd won't be guiding him, so he goes on his trip like he's never experienced before. Now, from here, we see Tom experiencing these blackouts, but he keeps mentioning he hears something, but he can't make out what he's hearing, which I think I have an idea what he's hearing, and we'll talk about that later. Meanwhile, he finds out that his son is missing, and speaking of his son, we see Evan hanging out with his friends and him going on his own trip as they're outside of the boogeyman's house smoking weed. Let's stick on Evan and his friends for a little bit here as we see them again. They're outside the boogeyman's house, they're smoking weed, and one of Evan's friends shares a story about what happened to the boogeyman, and it goes that the locals, and I don't know if the story is true or not, it could be an urban legend, but the locals tried to kill him by shooting him. That didn't work, so they end up burying the boogeyman in his own basement with concrete. Again, was the story true? Was it just like one of those small town urban legends? I think it's going to end up being true, and I can't wait to find out more about the boogeyman. But it is now later in the evening, and one of Evan's friends like challenges him or dares him to go inside the place, and he ends up not going because the sheriff comes and stops him just in time. Meanwhile, Wick pays a visit to Jerry, who, by the way, you can tell there's some romantic tension between these two characters, which I really enjoyed in this episode, but he's there to have her translate what he found in Bryce's office. Now, I'm not going to go word for word of what she said, but basically it read that the curse was on the island and that its heart is beating inside this cylinder that the person's husband wore on their neck. Now, we find out that the person that wrote this letter was Sarah Warren, which is Richard Warren's wife, and she ended up writing this before she died of a plague. Now, while that's happening, back with Tom, he ends up leaving his office after Patricia had to leave for questioning about what happened at the party, and this was just so funny to me when Dale like freaked out Tom because he was talking but his mouth wasn't moving, which I'm not gonna lie, that would freak me the hell out too. Now, Tom experiences another blackout and he wakes up in the middle of the meeting with the locals who's yelling and screaming at him about the curfew and the fireworks, but Tom blacks out again, but he ends up writing on the board about everyone turn around and close your eyes, but everyone already had left the meeting by the time he woke up. Let me know in the comments now, do you all think the locals were actually upset because they have this curfew and there's obviously not a lot to do on the island, or was this anger being built up from the island? Like, is this the curse making the locals upset? But back with Jerry, who was very helpful in this episode, she talks about how there was only one plague on the island that took place in 1702, and she's talking about the cylinder that was on Richard's neck and that he might have been buried with it. But as they're talking about this, we see Tom interrupts them as he tries to run away from the leash that Patricia has. Now, as Tom's trip is coming down, we see him with Rosemary, who's tasked with taking him home, but he has a meltdown at the gas station. We come to the end of this episode, we see Tom waiting for Evan at the end of the driveway, and they have a fight about how Evan feels like his dad's controlling him and won't let him leave the island. Now, this is important. Tom tells him that his mom was the one that says that she didn't want him to leave the island, and we find out why here in a second. Now, this leads to Tom coming to the end of his trip, and we see what actually happened to his wife. We see Tom having this vision about this time where him and his wife were about to go to the mainland, but on the boat, she suddenly goes blind. Now, we see Tom took her to the hospital. We find out that baby Evan's going to be okay, but then we see her on the hospital bed, and we can see that there's definitely something off about his wife. Now, this was important because remember what we found out a couple episodes ago, that locals cannot leave the island, or at least that's a superstition, right? Because if they leave the island, they end up dead. Now, that would explain why Tom's wife ended up dying, giving birth to Evan, because she was trying to leave the island. So that answers the question why Tom doesn't want him to leave. But now I'm starting to think, well, did something happen to baby Evan while he was in his mom's stomach? Like, obviously, he was born and she died, but I wonder if there's like some after effects with him being in her stomach when they were trying to leave. See Tom praying for the protection of his son, and suddenly the thing that Todd and his friends said that he wouldn't speak of, and the sound that Tom couldn't make out, he starts to hear it now more clearly, and this thing, whatever it is in the room with him, staring at him. So what do we know about this entity so far? We know that Todd's friend was never the same after their encounter with this thing, and the noise that it makes, I believe, is the same noise that Reverend Bryce heard before he allegedly took his own life. So now the question is, what will happen with Tom after his encounter with whatever this entity is? Will he end up never the same, or will he end up dead like Bryce? So let's talk about final questions and theories. So we know that the story's setting up that Evan wants to leave the island. So will his dad be able to stop him? Because if he leaves the island, we know what's going to happen to him. Now, we also found out more information about the founder and the cylinder that he wore on his neck. Like, we need to find out what that cylinder does. And also, think about Tom when he was blacking out. What was he actually experiencing? Will we ever fill in the blanks to see what he was doing? I know, like, it felt like he wasn't in his own body. So I wonder if we'll ever go back to see what he was actually experiencing, and if that's going to be key to getting answers. If y'all can't tell, I love this show. I love this episode. It wasn't as scary as the other four, but that's okay because it's still so well written. It was funny as hell. I love the lore that we find out in this episode. Matthew Rhys' performance was incredible. So let me know your thoughts, theories, and predictions of what you all thought about this episode in the comments below. And we'll be back next week talking about the next episode. But in the meantime, consider subscribing and following for more.